Hey there. Welcome to Conversation Design for Inclusive Usability. I'll be presenting today with Marcie Hill, my colleague who's a senior content strategist with a background in digital content design and conversation design. I'm Carissa Merrill, a senior experience designer, also at US Bank, with a background in accessibility and experience design. The agenda for today is an introduction to the terms accessibility and inclusive design, and then also an introduction to the practice. Then Marcia will be taking us through conversation structure and cognitive load considerations, followed by some high-level modality considerations and the resources. All right, so we're going to start off with an example that's always really resonated with me from Catherine Horwell and Ellie Thomas about a train use and experience for three different types of users. The first user has a visible disability, so someone, for instance, that would be using a wheelchair. If the lift to the platform isn't maintained, they won't be able to access the train at all, and so they'll have to find another ride or abandon their trip. The second example is someone with an invisible disability, so something like anxiety or agoraphobia. So imagine they go to the train station and it's really busy, super noisy, can be quite confusing with all of the people, and they get too overwhelmed, so they again have to find another mode of transportation or abandon their trip. The third consideration is for a woman. So this is a societal consideration wherein if she's using the platform and it's late at night and perhaps it's poorly lit and there's no one around, she may feel threatened or scared and again abandon the trip or use a different method of transportation. This is a really great example of just showing how one thing that should be usable for everyone has really different needs and use cases depending on how or what lens we're viewing the issues with. So just being cognizant of the visible, invisible, and society constructs. All right, so what are we talking about when we talk about accessibility or A11Y? It's called A11Y, just a shorthand because there's 11 letters between A and Y, just to call that out. You may see that someplace else. Essentially, we're working with the social model of accessibility, meaning that barriers are created, so therefore can be solved for people, not in that the barriers are people. So that's just a really big distinction in how we address and think about things. Kind of hearkening back to what we just talked about with visible, invisible, and societal considerations. The same thing kind of works with uh, disabilities as well. So there might be someone who has a permanent disability or something that was made for them. So something like curb cuts, for example, were made for assistive technology users like people with canes, crutches, or perhaps wheeled device like a wheelchair. But it also benefits people with temporary or situational disabilities as well. So while curb cuts were made, for something like a wheelchair, it also benefits someone that has, an injury or an illness, and they may be using assisted technology or appreciate the curb cutout for ease of use for a temporary situation. Then there's also situational design considerations. So for instance, the curb cuts are really beneficial for someone pulling a cart or pushing a stroller. So again, so just because the use case was made for an accessibility-minded solution, it also benefits everyone else with temporary and situational considerations as well. All right, so what is inclusive design? So basically, inclusive design is kind of expanding beyond that for accessibility into basically whatever makes people people. So this could be anything from language to socioeconomic background to different cultures, gender, or how people choose to identify, or age, or any other difference that makes people people. Like we want to be respectful of that and inclusive of that, and really make sure that we're bringing people in to the process, design, and solution. So everything from the business requirements through the ideation and the testing and QE, and making sure that it's a highly iterative process that we're not going to get right probably on the first or second go, but just keeping in mind that it is a methodology, and you need to bring people in to that for throughout the journey. Something that I have always thought was really interesting in just thinking about being inclusive in our process design and solution is there's a really interesting statistic wherein that diverse teams are actually more likely to check their personal biases. Just because if you're working closely with someone and you know that they have a different background than you, whether it's culture, socioeconomic background, age, whatever that may be, everyone brings a different lens and viewpoint into how they approach solutions. So when diverse teams have more they're just more likely to be cognizant of checking in and recognizing that that is their unique perspective, what are other people's, and kind of really asking those questions from a more unbiased lens, which is really cool and very great. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. This is a quote from W. Edwards Deming. We're on 8 here. So just calling out that essentially if you set up your system and processes to be accessible and inclusive, that's what you're going to get. And conversely, if you don't, you don't. So just being mindful that, this is a holistic approach. It isn't something that can just be added in after the fact, but something that should be carefully considered from every stakeholder and every role within the company. This really doesn't live within a practice or a discipline. The responsibility and the onus lies with everyone. I will say that we are super fortunate to have an accessibility community of practice at US Bank. But again, that model essentially works as like a consultative practice. So we're fortunate to have them to, inform our design and give feedback with a great diversity of reflection, even within that accessibility community of practice. But again, whether you're a design team of 1 or 100, everyone can learn and educate themselves and incorporate some of these findings into everything from, inclusive research and usability studies, whether moderated or unmoderated, or even, iterative design process that are tested and quantified with people. Something else that I do just want to call out that I think aligns with both the accessibility and the inclusive design movement is the mantra essentially from the accessibility movement, which is nothing about them without them. So just saying that when we're building people into these processes and systems, we're designing solutions with them, not for them. So just want to call that out as well. All right, so why does inclusive design matter? One, for innovation. When you're designing for kind of the outlier use cases, accessibility and inclusive design practices have often had a legacy of innovative products. Some historical examples of that would be the typewriter, which was made for a blind contessa so that she didn't have to have someone else scribe her letters for her, so she could have more private communication, which is very cool and obviously reverberated for a variety of other use cases. Some more recent examples would be text messaging or closed captioning, both made for deaf and hard of hearing users. But again, something that everybody uses and benefits from, particularly with text messaging. And I know I personally always watch my videos with closed captions on too. And yeah, with screen readers and assistive technology and voice, there's so much we can learn, whether it's, having adjustable speaking rates or, hearing, what are they called? Ear cons and haptics, and using those to inform a more holistic experience and kind of a brand identity there. So there's so much that can be learned and driven from inclusive design practices. Second, there's ethics. Of course, we all know that technology can and should be a great democratizer, and everyone legally has a right to access that information. So above and beyond it being, just like an ethical imperative thing, like it really is, the right thing to do. I'm happy to say that it can also increase your brand optics for not only the people that work for you, but also, consumers. I think it's safe to say that so many people are making more socially minded decisions these days as to where they spend and put their money. So that's something to consider as well. I know I'm super happy to say that US Bank was recently voted or ranked as 13th in the top companies to work for with people with disabilities, which I think is very cool. And so that impacts me as both a consumer and a person that works there. So, there's that to consider. And then there is also the cost. We are, of course, in the business of business. So accessibility and inclusive design can really benefit you in cost as well. So for instance, not only do you have access to a wider market when you're including people with disabilities and their friends and family, as well as including people of diverse cultures and backgrounds. So that just, it gives you a greater exposure and a greater market. But there's also the cost of remediation. So some of you may notice and have followed that accessibility litigation cases in the past couple of years have gone up more than 200%. A big example of that recently was the Domino's case, wherein a blind user was unable to order a pizza from their online platform. And it was appealed and taken to the Supreme Court and still upheld. So if anything, if you're not doing it for the innovation and for the ethics, by all means, the cost benefit of not having a lawsuit against you is certainly something to consider. Um, All right, so how do we apply this to voice? So essentially, you can apply this to voice and beyond, because really, I think like the main message here is that we'll find out, especially as we go through some of the examples that Marcie will take us with, is that accessibility and inclusive design practices are just good design. They're really good practice. They align with a lot of the heuristics that we find within WCAG, which is like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's a great resource. They align with a lot of the best practices that we've seen that are coming out and coming to the forefront, just in terms of how to structure conversation and considerations for cognitive load, as well as just allowing people multiple ways to access information. So I'm just going to hand it off to Marcie, and we'll take a look at how inclusive practices and conversation design set us up for success.
So inclusivity in dialogue design comes down to creating a structure that keeps cognitive load light and keeping stress and complexity levels as low as we can. So how do we do that? Ideally, turns in a voice-only conversation are the easiest to follow when a user's choices are narrowed down to a set of no more than 2 or maybe 3 options or actions that are clearly and simply articulated. So as an example, imagine you're thinking about applying for a credit card, and the interest rate is the most important question for you. So if you were to ask about interest rates in this case, the simplest response that you would get back would include the names of the cards and the associated interest rates. And then which card would you like to learn more about as a follow-up question? So when an open-ended question like that and a short list of 2 or 3 don't apply, and a longer list of names is the only option, we do risk cognitive overload. So how do we solve for that? Now, it's important to have tools in the box. And a heuristic, or a mental shortcut for forming judgments and choosing a course of action, is a commonly used cognitive device that people use all the time. Even though psychological and cognitive science research circles do consider them, heuristics rather, to be rather unreliable when it comes to making decisions where complex information and very high-level reasoning and rational thought are required. Now, if we're doing our job properly in dialogue design, complex information is not really an issue. Even a longer list is going to be as simplified as possible. So when a simple list of options, it truly is unavoidable, providing a heuristic to prepare the user for decision-making and for shortening their runway to that decision-making helps to lighten the cognitive load and offer a shorter runway to taking their next step. So some examples would be number of items in the list, category of the items, so what types of items, or the action that can be taken with the items. Some examples would be, an example rather is taken right out of Alexa, roughly paraphrased. So say you would ask, what are the closest Asian restaurants that deliver? The answer that you would get back would sound something like, here are a few nearby restaurants. So you know about how many are coming, and then they're listed out. And then a follow-up question is, you can ask me things like, what's the address? So that's a helpful example of a heuristic to help prep the user for what they're going to be hearing next so they can take the next step as quickly as they can. What else can we do? We can move to the next slide. So framing. Framing is all about how you say something. So it's not what you say, it is how you say it. And in constructing any voice experience, framing effects are perceptual. So you think of a glass being half full or half empty. It's the same glass, it's the same amount of liquid, but it's really a matter of how the user or person is viewing the glass that's going to govern their response to it. So a framing effect occurs when a user makes a choice that depends on whether the outcome is phrased as something that's going to be a gain or a positive, or whether it's going to be a loss or a negative. And cognitive linguistics can help with framing here. So a negative message can be placed in the context of a positive scenario. Now you can offer information as positive and concrete and avoid negating, say, what isn't there and what can't be done, and in so doing, avoiding activating concern or raising stress on the part of the users. Now this is particularly useful and important to do now in this time of COVID, given in the financial industry especially, the association that so many people make between their feelings and their finances, and the high levels of stress that so many are experiencing right now can be arguably considered a situational disability, as Carissa mentioned earlier. So many are experiencing this, so framing could be particularly useful. And I'd like to show a brief example of how framing works. So we can move to the next slide. So imagine, of all things, you raise cattle. It's a significant investment. And this scenario is based on a classic 1981 experiment by Tversky and Kahneman. And the details have been changed, but the logic and the numbers have not. So in this scenario, the cattle industry is preparing for an outbreak of hoof and mouth disease, which would take cattle out of the product stream. And it's expected to hit as many as 600 cattle in your area, and you're the cattle raiser once again. So 2 alternative programs to combat or manage the disease have been prepared, or proposed rather. So, sorry, this is obviously just going to be a practice run. So program A gives as its certainty 200 cattle who will be safe. And program B gives 1/3 probability that 600 cattle will be safe, so that's all of them, and a 2/3 probability that no cattle at all would be safe. So program A, as you can see, was selected by 72% of the participants in the experiment, and 28% of participants preferred program B. So why did they go for that? It's interesting because program A raises no concern, even though 400 cattle are fully expected to be unsafe, to be infected, whereas program B offers a level of ambiguity and a range of possibility, and it could be saving up to all of the cattle. So why did they choose program A, where there's a higher level of certainty, arguably, that many would be lost? So there's complexity of the information is provided. There's a high level of complexity. There's an uncertainty of the outcome in program B, and a mention of a probability of loss. "Quote unquote, no cattle would be safe." All of this raised the participants' risk aversion and triggered confusion and a degree of stress. And all of this is associated with ambiguity. Also, the word safe is important to note because it is a positive frame and connotes reassurance. And despite the fact that 400 cattle would be infected, program B would have possibly protected all 600. The participants responded more strongly to A, as we can see. So this example shows the critical impact of presenting information in concrete and positive terms to people. This definitely extends to voice users, where level of trust and security in voice experiences do vary based on our team's research. So we can move on to the next slide. Another consideration that's very important is in inclusive dialogue design is to try to be socioeconomically, and culturally neutral in crafting the dialogue, so the words themselves. That's never going to be easy, though, of course. In the United States alone, there are 430 languages spoken and signed, and cognitive science research suggests that there's an interplay within cultural groups between language and a shared understanding of the world, such as spatiality as an example, gendered attributes of objects, and others as well. So understanding what terms are common between socioeconomic groups within the US is key to understanding good word choices that are mutually understandable by everybody. So in our case, again, there are 430 languages spoken here in the US, and there are 24 dialects of SAE, or Standard American English, which roughly organize into the big three, so New England, Southern, and Western General America. Now, at US Bank, our bias is toward using Western General America. It's the largest recognized dialect area, and it is where our headquarters is located and where most of our customers live. That being said, though, it's important, even given that, even given where you may be and who you believe you may be designing for, to aim for as much neutrality as you can. And when aiming for human, but not too human, of course, conversational voice, it is important to watch for those regionalisms, for, again, gendered or economically biased terms or colloquialism that may alienate users in an attempt to come across as familiar. Now, total perfection in this area is simply an impossibility, but it's important to always be looking for opportunities to neutralize dialogue and to avoid those regionalisms, to be as inclusive and inviting to as many as possible. So with that, I will hand it back to Carissa, who will dive into multimodality and cohesive ecosystems. Take it away, Carissa.
Okay, so now just to think about what does that mean with conversation design when we're getting into multimodal realms. So just that conversation can be and should be constructed depending on what environment and use case that your user is meeting them. So we kind of have like this methodology wherein we kind of say like to meet people where they are. For instance, if they're blind and low vision users and always using voice forward, or if they're situationally using it because they're potentially hands-free or on the run or whatever that may be, or if there is a consideration for an IoT or an Internet of Things like a device. So something that you may use voice when you're at home and there, but you may control something like a thermostat remotely through an app when you're away. The other consideration is, more traditional multimodal devices. So we could, for instance, have um, voice in the terms of desktop, tablet, or mobile devices, or even, there's, watches too, or other devices of that nature. So just knowing that we construct experiences and conversations, being very cognizant and aware of like, is there an accompanying interface or is there not? And what are those experiences like? Fully knowing that when we meet people where they are, like that situation may change. Like that may be an adaptable scenario. They could be using voice forward while at home, but multimodal when they're out in public, or vice versa. And it's really just being adaptable and flexible. The other thing that we like to think of is, considering a holistic experience approach. So when we are making services and designing solutions for people, we realize that there needs to be a multitude of ways to access that information, right? So, even if we're voice forward, there's always a text input button, or, something that is accessible for people with various types of assistive technology that may be relying on a different multimodal user interface. So just being cognizant of the fact that voice is a way to access your service or your experience or your platform. So just be sure to give people a multitude of ways to have that interaction in the best way. And then also being sure that we're leveraging what is the best experience for that platform. For instance, voice forward would be super great. Like for instance, if you're driving in your car and you get an alert that some sort of service needs to be done, but because you want to have all of your attention dedicated to the road, you certainly don't want to handle it now. So if it would be gracefully handed off in a text message or perhaps a reminder to make a phone call and follow up on that, like that would be something, that would be an example of really leveraging that ecosystem and working within the parameters of like where is the best, what methodology is the best way to continue driving the conversation forward and really make it intuitive and insightful for people. Again, like something like perhaps a form or something of that nature is still best served, at least for now, perhaps on a desktop. So just being cognizant of how you make those trade-offs, where you want to leverage, like more robust experiences and where you want to hand off to make the most of your experience holistically. All right, so slide 17 here, we're looking at audio and visual comprehension. So some things to be aware of too as we look at different platforms and also how things are interactive with audio or visual affordances is just comprehension. So a typical user, not screen reader users, because I will say that they have a much higher than average listening comprehension rate, which is very cool. But for non-screen reader users, typically the words per minute for audio comprehension is about 125. And for typical like visual readers, it's about 200. But when you pair that with audio and visual, you can almost double that words per minute comprehension, which is very cool. So also another way to be sure that when we're talking about conversation design and really the whole experience design of your voice technology products and different platforms, that we're really making the most of that. For instance, if you're just having kind of like higher level ideas and it's kind of more of like the generalities of the thing, like audio only. Whereas if you have particularly complex thoughts, like something with numbers, percentages, or even like comparables, that might be better illustrated with like an at a glance comprehension of like data visualization or something like that. Just be sure that you're leveraging whatever modality is best for comprehension for your users. And be sure to really prove that out with testing and comprehension. So yeah, so that's just another thing to be considerate of. All right. So just wrapping up here, we've touched on a lot of things and in a variety of different details. But again, the main message here is that progress is possible and perfection is not. So some three things to leave you with and remind you that accessibility and inclusive design are everyone's responsibility. It lives in every role, regardless of practice. And two, that incremental change is still change. So in being that it is everyone's responsibility, it can be quite overwhelming and daunting, but really you just need to find out what's applicable for your role or your situation and just start learning like little bits here and there and apply them as you can, because every little bit pushes the arrow in the right direction. So just be cognizant of that, and it's always a work in progress. And then third, perfect is the enemy of good, kind of reinforcing that, just saying that you're never going to reach perfection. We never will. That's why this is a really beautiful, highly iterative design process for everyone, not just you. So just remember that good design now that, again, uses that incremental change that kind of takes everyone's responsibility into consideration really does make for a good experience and provides good usability and good design. So just be mindful of that and just keep learning. All right, some resources here just to cruise through these quick. For slide 19, we're looking at web content accessibility guidelines. Again, this is something that's often used for compliance, but has some really great ideas of just like understanding the intent of inclusive practices, as well as really strong recommendations for success criteria and different techniques for, especially those cognitive considerations, but also, motor, audio, visual, etc. So I will say too that both the Alexa and the Google accessibility kits and suites are very well aligned with WCAG. So again, this just kind of reinforces that when we talk about inclusive design practices, it really is good design and good usability practice. Same thing goes for, Apple has some really great built-in native accessibility with their HIG, their human interface guidelines. And Microsoft has a lot of great systems that you can kind of plug and play to kind of like catalyze or, expand on the services that might be offered. Some of our favorite books here are Mismatch, How Inclusion Shapes Design, a book by Kat Holmes. She also has a wonderful online platform where we can talk about kind of like mismatched experiences for people and design and how we can solve them. And then Weapons of Math Destruction, which is a book by Kathy O'Neill, and has been really impactful just in how data that goes into empowers everything these days can really be a weapon of social good or bad. So just being very aware of that. That's a very fun read. All right. So again, thank you so much for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. Please feel free to contact Marcie and myself on LinkedIn or Twitter, or just keep the conversation going. I look forward to connecting with some of you soon. Thank you.